The national living wage increasing by £1,400. That's a pay rise for millions of workers. We've announced £150 for the Warm Homes discount, extended now to 6 million households. That's 1 in 5 families. And wages are going up faster than prices. And never forget, the party opposite, worst living standards on record, inflation up to 11%, public services left on their knees.
In today's fast-paced political landscape, nothing creates more waves than an explosive interview with a prominent leader. That's exactly what we saw when Keir Starmer, the leader of the UK Labour Party, was grilled by an interviewer over the recent spring budget and its supposed promises. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Starmer was confronted with the very issue that has ignited public debates across the nation: the government's promise that Britons would be £500 sterling better off by the end of the year. This promise, which was initially presented as a beacon of hope for struggling families, quickly became the center of controversy when reality failed to match the hype. Starmer, usually calm and composed, found himself caught in a web of contradictions as the interviewer pushed harder, drawing attention to the undeniable gap between the government's rhetoric and the financial reality for ordinary citizens. The core of the controversy stems from the spring budget, where the government heralded the £500 sterling boost as evidence of their commitment to improving living standards. The Labour Party in particular had placed significant emphasis on this pledge, positioning it as a key victory for the working class. Yet, as soon as the budget was dissected by economic analysts and watchdogs, it became clear that the reality was far more grim. The £500 sterling, which was supposed to bring relief to millions, was now being revealed as a mere illusion, an empty promise that would do little to alleviate the mounting financial pressure on the average Briton. The interviewer wasted no time in calling Starmer out on this discrepancy, pointing out the mismatch between the government's optimistic projections and the reality that the majority of people would feel far worse off before any improvement could be expected. This moment of accountability, where Starmer's words collided with the facts, became a crucial turning point in the interview. As the interview progressed, Starmer, clearly flustered, attempted to defend his position by referencing other government measures like the national living wage and the reduction in interest rates. He pointed to these as proof that the government was still committed to easing financial burdens. However, the more he spoke, the more the inconsistencies within his narrative became glaringly obvious. The promises, once painted in the most glowing terms, were now being torn apart by hard-hitting questions. Despite his best efforts to steer the conversation back to optimistic notes, the interviewer refused to let go of the key issue: the undeniable gap between political promises and the harsh reality facing families. Starmer's credibility was at stake, and it was clear that his handling of the situation would determine not only the public's trust but also the future of the Labour Party's stance on economic issues. The promise of £500 sterling in financial relief for Britons, touted as part of the government's spring budget, was one that sparked both optimism and scepticism. At first glance, it seemed like a much-needed lifeline for families grappling with the rising cost of living. However, as the weeks passed and economic experts began to dissect the details of the budget, the truth behind this pledge began to unravel. The idea that British citizens would find themselves £500 sterling better off in the near future was quickly debunked as nothing more than a mirage. The Office for Budget Responsibility, OBR itself, a respected body tasked with overseeing fiscal matters, contradicted the government's optimistic projections. Instead of a financial boost, the OBR's findings revealed that in reality, most people would feel worse off in the short term before any potential improvements could be realized. This was a bitter pill to swallow, especially for those who had placed their hope in the government's promises. As the facts began to surface, it became evident that the government had overpromised and underdelivered. While the budget initially painted a picture of prosperity, highlighting the £500 sterling boost as a crucial step toward economic recovery, the reality was far less glamorous. For many families, the cost of living continued to climb, with energy bills, housing costs, and general inflation far outpacing any supposed gains. The gap between the promise and the reality left citizens frustrated and disillusioned, questioning the government's ability to truly deliver on its pledges. In the midst of this growing discontent, the Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, found itself on the defensive. During an interview with Sky News, Starmer was pressed about the government's claim that people would be £500 sterling better off. It was at this moment that the interviewer exposed the falsehood at the heart of the spring budget. The interviewer pointed out that rather than the £500 sterling uplift, people were more likely to experience a decline in their financial situation before any improvement could be seen. This revelation left Starmer scrambling to justify the government's position, but it was clear that the numbers simply didn't add up. The once promising narrative of economic relief had been thoroughly debunked, and the interview served as a reminder of how easily political promises can be exposed for what they truly are: well-meaning but ultimately hollow assurances. As the dust settled on the interview, it became apparent that the spring budget had failed to deliver the relief that many had hoped for. The £500 sterling claim, now shattered by the OBR's assessment, only further eroded the public's confidence in the government. What was once seen as a key pillar of their economic strategy had been exposed as little more than a political talking point. For the people who had placed their trust in these promises, the reality was far more sobering. As the interview progressed, Keir Starmer attempted to steer the conversation back to what he considered the positive aspects of the government's actions, particularly the increase in the national living wage. He emphasized the significance of this wage hike, which, according to Starmer, would make a real difference for millions of workers across the country. The promise was bold: an average increase of £1,400 sterling annually, starting today. For many people, this additional money would provide much-needed relief, especially in the face of rising inflation and the ever-increasing cost of living. Starmer painted a picture of the wage boost as a tangible, immediate solution, arguing that the money would be coming into workers' pockets right away, thus improving their financial situation. However, as the interviewer dug deeper into the specifics, the cracks in Starmer's argument began to show. While the wage increase was certainly an important step, it became evident that the Labour leader was relying heavily on this one measure to distract from the broader economic reality. Starmer's unwavering focus on the national living wage increase seemed somewhat out of place, given that many families were still struggling with soaring bills and stagnant wages in other areas. Yes, some workers might see a financial improvement, but what about the millions of others who were already feeling the pinch from rising energy costs and inflation that outpaced any wage increase? Starmer's response, though delivered with conviction, seemed to gloss over the deeper economic challenges that people were facing, such as job insecurity and the crushing weight of inflation on essential goods. The more he spoke, the more it became clear that the national living wage was only a small part of a much larger, more complex economic puzzle. The interviewer pressed Starmer on whether these small increases would really offset the larger financial pressures that most people were experiencing. Starmer, perhaps feeling the pressure mounting, doubled down on the idea that wages were rising faster than prices, but even he couldn't deny the reality of the ongoing cost of living crisis. His rhetoric about wages rising faster than inflation fell flat when compared to the lived experiences of millions who were watching their bills rise at a rate much quicker than their paychecks. Despite his best efforts to stay optimistic, the growing sense of financial instability loomed large in the conversation. Starmer's explanation, while well-intentioned, couldn't shake the undeniable truth that, for many, the increase in the national living wage, as substantial as it was, wasn't enough to make a meaningful difference in their day-to-day lives. The deeper issue, the one that had yet to be truly addressed, was the broader economic mismanagement that had led to this situation in the first place. The wage increase was a start, but it was clear that much more needed to be done if the government hoped to offer any genuine relief to the British people. As the interview continued, the conversation shifted to broader critiques of the government's handling of the economy. Keir Starmer found himself on the defensive, unable to deny the harsh reality that many Britons were feeling the weight of the ongoing economic crisis. While the national living wage increase had been presented as a positive step, it was becoming clear that the financial situation for many families was still dire. Rising inflation, higher taxes, and the increasing costs of everyday goods and services were putting enormous strain on households. These issues, which affected everyone from working families to pensioners, could not be brushed aside by a simple wage increase. The true scale of the economic crisis was more than just about pay packets. It was about the affordability of living itself. Starmer's insistence that the government's policies, such as the wage increase and the reduction of interest rates, were effective solutions, only seemed to highlight the disconnect between political rhetoric and the lived experiences of the public. The presenter highlighted how inflation was rising faster than wages in many sectors, meaning that even with wage increases, people were still struggling to make ends meet. Starmer's focus on certain financial measures such as tax cuts and interest rate reductions failed to address the core issues of rising prices and stagnant wage growth that had been plaguing the British economy for years. It was as though the government's approach was a patchwork of short-term fixes, rather than a comprehensive solution to the long-term financial struggles of millions of families. The more Starmer spoke about the positive aspects of the Labour government's policies, the more the interviewer pointed out the glaring contradictions in his arguments. For example, Starmer's claim that interest rates had been lowered under Labour's leadership seemed almost irrelevant to those facing astronomical energy bills and skyrocketing food prices. Yes, lower interest rates might have eased the burden for some mortgage holders, but what about those who didn't own homes? The reality for many families was that they were caught between soaring living costs and a government that seemed increasingly out of touch with their struggles. The government's economic mismanagement was becoming more evident by the day. The interview made it painfully clear that, despite some positive measures, the public was still not feeling the full benefits of these policies. For many, the promises made by the government, including the idea of being better off financially, were beginning to ring hollow. The public's patience was wearing thin, and the government's inability to truly tackle the root causes of the economic crisis, rising costs, stagnant wages, and economic inequality, was quickly becoming a major point of contention. It was becoming clear that despite the government's best efforts to paint a rosy picture, the reality for the majority of the British public was one of financial hardship and uncertainty. As the interview drew to a close, the discussion turned to another critical issue: the looming threat of tariffs, especially those imposed by former US President Donald Trump. Starmer found himself in a particularly uncomfortable position, as his party's economic policies were now being questioned in light of these new trade challenges. The interviewer seized the opportunity to press Starmer on the potential impact of these tariffs, which threatened to severely disrupt the UK economy. According to reports, these tariffs, set to come into effect soon, would increase the financial strain on businesses and consumers alike, exacerbating the already fragile economic situation. While Starmer insisted that the Labour Party was working diligently on securing an economic deal to mitigate the damage, his reassurances did little to calm growing concern. The interviewer's pointed questions seemed to underline the growing sense of urgency surrounding the situation. Starmer acknowledged the potential for tariffs, but continued to downplay their immediate impact, suggesting that the government was actively negotiating with the sectors most affected. However, the interviewer quickly cut through these reassurances, pointing out that many in the UK were already feeling the effects of a precarious trade relationship with the US, and these tariffs could only make things worse. Starmer's responses, though carefully measured, failed to address the real concerns of those watching, particularly in industries that stood to lose the most from these economic pressures. One of the most difficult moments in the interview came when Starmer was asked about his relationship with Donald Trump, the very man whose policies were directly leading to the imposition of tariffs. It was no secret that Starmer had attempted to maintain a cordial relationship with the US during Trump's presidency, but now, with the tariffs looming large, it was clear that the political dynamics had shifted. The interviewer questioned whether Starmer felt betrayed by Trump, especially given the economic repercussions of his policies. Starmer, ever the diplomat, was quick to emphasize the importance of maintaining a strong relationship with the US, particularly in terms of defense and intelligence cooperation. Yet his words seemed to ring hollow against the backdrop of a looming economic crisis. Despite Starmer's efforts to deflect blame and maintain composure, the reality was undeniable. The UK was facing a potentially catastrophic economic situation, and Labour's handling of it was under intense scrutiny. The tariffs would hit British consumers hard, and the government's inability to resolve these trade issues with the US only deepened the sense of uncertainty. Starmer's repeated assurances that all options are on the table did little to reassure the public, as the looming economic storm continued to gather strength. The interview made it clear that the Labour Party, for all its talk of economic recovery, was struggling to come to terms with the real challenges facing the country. As the interview concluded, the broader implications of the government's failures became increasingly clear. Keir Starmer's leadership was coming under severe scrutiny, not just for his inability to effectively address the cost of living crisis, but also for the broader economic mismanagement under the Labour Party's watch. The £500 sterling promise that had initially seemed like a beacon of hope for struggling Britons was now exposed as an illusion, a hollow promise that did little to alleviate the crushing financial burdens faced by millions. The interviewer's relentless questioning revealed just how far removed Starmer's optimistic statements were from the harsh realities people were living through. The contrast between his assurances and the lived experiences of families who were already feeling the impact of rising inflation, skyrocketing energy bills, and stagnant wages could not have been more glaring. What was once framed as an economic recovery plan was now disintegrating in the face of the mounting financial pressures. Starmer's attempts to shift focus to isolated measures like the national living wage increase were becoming increasingly transparent as desperate attempts to mask a far deeper crisis. Meanwhile, the looming tariffs, set to increase the strain on the already fragile economy, were another stark reminder of the government's failure to secure vital trade deals. As Starmer scrambled to defend his position, it became clear that the Labour Party's promises had not only fallen short but had begun to unravel completely, leaving the public with little faith in the government's ability to navigate the storm ahead. See you later!